So allow me to welcome you in the name of the Pourdavoud Center for the Study of the Iranian World and the Program of Iranian Studies at the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Cultures to the 11th Ehsan Yarshater Lecture Series at UCLA, to be held by my esteemed colleague, Professor Robert Rollinger, on the Achaemenid Persian World Empire. Before proceeding with the proper introduction of our speaker, I would like to provide some background on the Yarshater Lecture Series and acknowledge the eponymous founder, the late Professor Yarshater, the Kevorkian Chair of Iranian Studies at Columbia, and the founding editor, among others, of the monumental Encyclopedia Iranica, valiantly continued by the Yarshater Center at Columbia and now published with Brill, the Cambridge History of Iran, and the History of Persian Literature, published with I.B. Torres. The venerable doctoral programs of Iranian studies were in the entire range of the Iranian experience, from the pre-Islamic period to the classical age, were taught, have always formed a pleiad of institutions, notably the programs established at Harvard University in 1957 by the late Professor Richard Fry, at UCLA in 1963. We shall be celebrating 60 years of its existence next year, and at UCLA, and at Columbia University in 1968 by Ehsan Yarshater, as well as in Paris in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, at a host of different institutions such as l'Institut des Études Iraniennes at the Sorbonne, le Centre National des Recherches Scientifiques, the Collège de France, and la Délégation Archéologique Française en Iran, led by such luminaries as Louis Massignon, René Labat, Henri Corbin, and Émile Benveniste. There is no doubt that an esprit de corps and academic reciprocity characterized the exchanges between these eminent programs, and it was thus consequent as a means further to promote synergies and dialogue in the field that the Ehsan Yarshater lecture series were almost simultaneously established at Harvard, UCLA, and the Sorbonne in the past decades by Professor Yarshater. With all things ancient Iranian being happily defunct at Harvard, the Yarshater lecture series are now held at UCLA, the SOAS, the Collège de France, and more recently at Yale University. The Yarshater lecture series were inspired by Les Leçons au Collège de France and are delivered by a distinguished scholar whose work has lastingly impacted the study of the Iranian world. Each series consists of 4 to 5 lectures on a single theme that is subsequently elaborated and amplified into a monograph. The lectures thus represent original research and synthesis in all aspects of Iranian studies. We are hence exceedingly honored that the 11th Biennial Ehsan Yarshater lecture series is held by our eminent colleague, Professor Robert Rollinger, whose intellectual werdegang I shall strive to summarize as succinctly as possible, which, however, in view of the immensity of his publication, might prove challenging. Dr. Rollinger is Professor of Ancient History and Ancient Near Eastern Studies at the University of Innsbruck, as well as the co-director of the Institute for Alte Geschichte und Altorientalistik, where he has been holding since 2005 the chair for cultural interactions between the ancient Near East and the Mediterranean. He is a thorough product of the University of Innsbruck, having received here both his MA with a brilliant thesis on the Herodotean Logos, on which I shall come back later, under the tutelage of the classical historian Reinhold Bichler in 1989, and his PhD with an unpublished work on the origins of historical thinking in ancient Mesopotamia called Frühformen historischen Denkens, Geschichtsdenken, Ideologie und Propaganda im alten Mesopotamien, under the joint supervision of Manfred Bichler and the famed Sumerologist Manfred Schretter in 1993. He was also granted his venia legendi by habilitating at the University of Innsbruck in 1999. Dr. Rollinger's scholarly interests are wide-ranging and encompass the cultural expanse between the Aegean world and the ancient Near East, with a special focus on ancient historiography, the comparative history of empires, and the Achaemenid Empire in particular. In addition to his tenure at the University of Innsbruck, he has held a number of prestigious chairs and fellowships worldwide. From 2010 to 15, he was a Finland Distinguished Professor at the University of Helsinki in the Department of World Cultures. In 2020, he was a Getty Scholar here at the Getty Villa. And since 2020, he has been the NAVA chair at the University of Wrocław in Poland, where he heads the international project From the Achaemenid to the Roman Rule. He is also member of numerous academic organizations and research groups, among them the Austrian Academy of Sciences, the ÖAW, the German Archaeological Institute, the DAI, and the Academia Europaea. Professor Rollinger belongs to that rare breed of historians of antiquity, the kinds of whom we used to find in the German-speaking world in the turn of the 19th and 20th century, for whom the world of antiquity constituted a connected expanse, a single tapestry, which, notwithstanding linguistic and cultural specificities, the historian of the ancient world had fully to grasp and maintain as a backdrop, so that more discrete phenomena could be explored against it. Thus, for him, the Mediterranean and ancient Near Eastern worlds are so profoundly intertwined that he often moves beyond more rudimentary notions of exchanges and connections and strives to understand this geography as an indivisible, entangled expanse, calling for a more integrative treatment of the ancient world. Needless to say, to foster such ambitions today at a time of extreme specialization may be anathema to many. But Professor Rollinger's extraordinary publications and activities are a testimony that such a view has a legitimate place in the academia and such pursuits are worthy of emulation. His work is too multifarious to risk an introduction at this juncture. Suffice it to say, his writings, beginning with this by now classical monograph on the Herodotean narrative on Babylonia, that is the Herodotos babylonische Logos, eine kritische Untersuchung der Glaubwürdigkeitsdiskussion, is a must for all students of ancient history and exquisitely illustrates not only his ability to command over different literary traditions, both cuneiform and classical, critically to assess or innovatively to synthesize them, but more importantly shows his grand and wide perspective on what constitutes ancient history and historiography in the tradition we just described. Numerous are his monographs, among them the more recent Alexander und die großen Ströme, and articles on Hellas and the ancient Near East, on forms of historical thinking, ideology, propaganda, and ancient Persia. As impressive as his writings are, his editorial work is even more breathtaking. By dint of their quality and sheer number, his edited volumes in a variety of outlets have reestablished the holistic study of the ancient world as a discipline. Before the plague, there were some 60 edited volumes, but then came the pandemic, and Robert could attend conferences no more, shot the globe no more. So I wouldn't be surprised if meanwhile the number were to be doubled. I must confess that his publication is a major source of despair to me and many commiserating colleagues, who in vain strive to catch up with reading them, since reviewing them would require at least 5 leçons by itself. I shall just refer to this bibliography on the brochure, which I have successfully reduced to half a page with much schadenfreude. This notwithstanding, I would like to point to a number of signal achievements. Robert Rollinger's work, in conjunction with Michael Gehler, on a grammatology of empires, that is the worthy attempt to infer, through comparison of numerous empires throughout the ages, on a catalogue of criteria, which he calls criterion catalogue, characterizing imperial polities, has led to the publication of a noteworthy series and sundry valuable volumes on empires, the so-called Imperien und Reiche in der Weltgeschichte, epochenübergreifende und global historische Vergleiche. I am through with this sentence. Most recently, he has published, together with Bruno Jacobs, the Blackwell Companion to the Achaemenid Empire, which undoubtedly will serve as a new work of reference in the field. Now, having taxed your patience long enough, my introduction is drawing on. In his first lecture today, an Afro Eurasian hyperpower and its ancient Near Eastern roots in the first millennium BCE, Dr. Rollinger shall focus on the structure, genesis, and historical setting of the Achaemenid Empire by discussing major aspects of the royal ideology, the position of the great king, and the empire's resilience in periods of crisis. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Rollinger.
So first of all, I have to thank Rahim for this very, very kind introduction, and much too much, Rahim, but I have to say that, you know, I remember very well when we met for the first time in person in Kiel, and for me this became a very special and very important relationship, not only one of deep friendship, but also one opening up new dimension of scholarly research and of cooperation. And I'm really very, very much honored, dear Rahim, being here and having the opportunity to present these lectures. So the first one will be somehow, or let's say, will try to establish somehow the basis for what I'm going to develop in lecture 2, 3, and 4, giving, as you may take it, my personal view on the empire and on the Achaemenid Persian Empire and the most important aspects which I want to highlight. So I will present the paper in 3 steps, as you can see here. The first one, there will be a first introduction, and then 2 main topics which I'm going to deal with. One on narrative history, as I see it, and the other one on structures, which might be even more important. So let's start with the introduction. The Persian Achaemenid, or simply Persian Empire, is the last ancient Near Eastern empire, and at the same time the ancient Near Eastern empire with the largest territory. It is embedded in a continuum of ancient Near Eastern empires, which is traditionally divided into the successive Neo-Assyrian, Neo-Babylonian, and Persian Achaemenid empires. However, historical and structural continuities which cross the boundaries between these empires can be observed, while discontinuities within each of these phases can also be recognized. This fundamental observation is also valid for the era which followed the Persian Empire, the Macedonian World Empire of Alexander III, or as he is also labeled, the Great, and the kingdoms of the successors. The history of the Persian Achaemenid Empire may be divided in 2 separate phases, which are defined by 2 successive ruling dynasties. At the beginning stands the house of the Thespids, as you can see here, to which Cyrus the Great, Cambyses, and Bardia belonged. This extends chronologically from the rise to supremacy under Cyrus II in the 550s BC until the death of Cambyses and Bardia in the year 522 BC. After a short period of disturbance followed the house of the Achaemenids, which took power under Darius I in 521 and ended with the death of Artaxerxes V, or Bessos, in 329. These 2 phases are also linked by continuities and subdivided by discontinuities. The transition took place during a civil war, which involved almost the entire empire, which Darius I successfully ended with his accession to the throne. The Persian Achaemenid Empire shaped the history of the Near East for more than 200 years. Aside from the aforementioned disturbances in the year 522, 521, the empire was never again threatened in its existence until the campaigns of Alexander III, and for the most part was able to maintain its territorial integrity for the entire stretch of time. So let's start with some consideration on narrative history. The emergence of the empire can only be roughly sketched due to, in some ways, poor state of our sources. Its beginnings are entrenched in the history of Elam and Anshan in southwestern Iran. On a broader level, it can be understood as the heir of the ancient Eastern empires which preceded it. A decisive step in this respect was Cyrus' conquest of Babylon in 539 BC, by which the Neo-Babylonian Empire fell into his hands. Cyrus had come into power in the 550s. His basis of power was the historical region of Anshan, Parsa, Greek Persis, nowadays the province of Fars, and the Elamite heartland, which bordered on it to the north, where for several hundred years an entangled Elamite Persian koine had developed. About the predecessors of Cyrus we have hardly any historical information. The conquest of the Median heartland around Ekbatana Hamadan, which is to be placed at the end of the 550s, indicated a significant increase of power. So you can see here the steps of conquest. Shortly thereafter, in 547, eastern Anatolia was conquered, which was followed by the overthrow of Lydia, likely at the end of the 540s. With this thrust into Western Asia Minor, the spatial dimensions of the previous ancient Eastern empires had already been exceeded. The Neo-Babylonian Empire was now faced with a new power block to its north, east, and southeast, to which it itself fell victim, and Cyrus became its successor. Although Cyrus succeeded in one blow in annexing an empire which extended across the whole of Mesopotamia, as well as Syria and Palestine, from the borders of Egypt up to and including Cilicia, he continued to expand the boundaries of his empire afterwards. However, the following campaigns can only be extrapolated roughly from the sources. Although the subjugation of the Median core region affected an area which reached at least to the neighborhood of modern Tehran, at an unknown time in his, or maybe even also including Cambyses' reign, a large part of Central Asia was also annexed to the empire, approximately corresponding to the modern states of Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and Afghanistan. Thereby, the young ruler controlled a huge space that reached from the Levant to Central Asia. This included large areas of desert and arid zones spotted by oases, especially on the Iranian highlands and further to the east. In later periods, these zones were a conducive environment for the emergence and development of so-called nomadic empires. Whether this specific natural environment encouraged Achaemenid expansion to the east is difficult to say. Be this as it may, the Persian Achaemenid Empire, as well as its ancient Near Eastern predecessors, represent examples of sedentary empires and cannot be qualified as nomadic empires. What Richard Payne noted for the Sasanian Empire, based on the geopolitical situation of the Iranian highlands, must also have been true for the Achaemenid Persian Empire in its early stages. I quote, "The geography of Iran posed major disadvantages to empire formation, not least the difficulty of extracting revenues from disparate highland territories and the high costs and slow pace of transferring agrarian produce overland to imperial centers. But its predicament also represented a potential advantage located at the nexus of the largest Eurasian markets." End of quote. Although there was nothing comparable with the Roman and Chinese markets of Sasanian times, the emerging Persian Empire was at the nexus of all major trading routes connecting Afro Eurasian worlds, and I will deal with this in more detail with my second lecture. The Achaemenids just expanded what their Tazbid predecessors had established, following the already existing trajectories, which started to become even more important. The expansion was also carried on by Cyrus' successor Cambyses. In the 520s, Egypt and Cyprus were incorporated in the empire. To what extent part of the Arabian Peninsula was controlled in this period escapes to our knowledge. This expansion did not come to an end with the disturbances in 522, 521, which occurred after the death of Cambyses and continued until the beginning of the rule of the Achaemenids. Darius I and his army marched in all cardinal directions as a successful conqueror king. Under him, Cyrenaica and Thrace were annexed. Macedonia accepted the status of a vassal. In the east, part of India, especially modern Pakistan, was incorporated into the empire. The historicity of a campaign against the Scythians north of the Danube, however, which became a popular theme in Greek historical writing, remains in question. The time of the so-called Persian Wars takes a special place in the classical tradition, while the ancient Eastern sources do not devote a single word to them. After the uprising of Greek cities in Asia Minor, known as the Ionian Revolt, was successfully suppressed, the Persians reached out into the Aegean. A first fleet was destroyed by the stormy Aegean Sea. 2 years later followed a landing in Attica, which was successfully driven back by an Athenian army. The conflict with Athens may have been connected with the fact that Athenian ambassadors had made a loyalty oath to the great king in 507-506. On this ground, the great king understood the support of the Ionian revolt with Athenian and Eretrian contingents as a violation of a treaty. The particular peak of the conflict with the roughly 30 members of the so-called Hellenic League occurred in the reign of Xerxes. After becoming king, he fell upon central Greece through Thessaly in a combined sea and land operation and overran a holding position occupied by Spartan and Thespian troops at Thermopylae. In the same year, Athens was conquered and a Persian victory seemed to be within the reaches. Despite this, the defeats in the naval battle at Salamis and the land battle at Plataea made it necessary that the troops led by the Persians withdrew from Greece. As a consequence of these events, control over Macedonia and Thrace was also lost. For the West, these events had a very different significance than for the great king himself. In spite of the great military efforts in which he had led his troops far from home into the field and showed that it was at least logistically possible for the troops to winter in the farthest ends of the empire, from the Persian point of view, the events can certainly not have had the overwhelming significance which was heaped upon them from the Greek and, above all, the modern European side. There, the Persian wars were stylized into a struggle between East and West, Asia and Europe, slavery and freedom, despotism and democracy. However, such a view ignores how many Greek cities of central and northern Greece, as well as Asia Minor, had campaigned on the side of the Persians, or at least held themselves neutral and kept themselves distant from the armed conflict. In any case, at this time, the empire reached its maximum extent, which reached from the Balkans in the northern Aegean to Transoxiana, modern Uzbekistan, and India, modern Pakistan. Population numbers of this vast empire can only be roughly estimated. They have been calculated between 17 and 33 million people. At the same time, the expansion came to an halt. Whether this should be attributed to the strength of new opponents or certain signs of overstretch, which made a consolidation of the already acquired territory necessary, is difficult to decide. The interpretation of this situation is also bound up with the difficult question of which goals the great king pursued in the course of his campaigns against the Greek cities. If one understands the Persian wars as a kind of expansion toward a buffer zone, and therefore as an attempt to extend indirect rule by the creation of a ring of vassal states, rather than as campaigns aimed at total conquest and subjugation, then the Greek campaign could already be understood as part of this consolidation phase. Moreover, there is another aspect to be taken into account. Since Darius I was a usurper and his son Xerxes not the heir apparent, both must have felt a certain pressure to legitimize their rule. This was completely different with the next Achaemenid on the throne, Artaxerxes I, with whom expansion came to an halt. The connection between the need for legitimization and an expansionist agenda is a well-known phenomenon in world history. In any case, the further expansion to the west failed, with the result that until the king's peace in the year 387-386, the loss of territory in the eastern Aegean also had to be accepted. If one believes the historical tradition, Cyrus the Great had already not only been defeated in his attempt to extend the boundaries of the empire in the east against the Scythian resistance, but also lost his life in this endeavor. Yet this setback did not threaten the existence of the empire. Things stood differently in the crisis year 522-521, in which the empire was convulsed by a series of uprisings in which almost all of the core zones, except for the Far East and Asia Minor, participated. Despite this, the empire mastered these crises successfully. Separatist movements did not entirely vanish under the successors of Darius I. Under Xerxes, true revolts in Babylonia are attested. Later it was Egypt in particular which created problems for the great kings, and in fact was able to win independence between 404 and 343 BC. Each of these revolts posed as little threat to the existence of the empire as the civil war of the year 501, when Artaxerxes II and his brother Cyrus the Younger struggled for the throne. The former successfully held on to his position at the Battle of Cunaxa. In the end, all of these uprisings were suppressed. With the aforementioned king's peace of the year 387, the great king Artaxerxes regained full control over Cyprus and Western Asia Minor. This had the result that the Aegean fell back under indirect rule of the great king. When the Koine Irene was established in 387, it was the great king who acted as arbiter and mediation instance in the Greek world. He did so until 337, when Philip II of Macedon introduced his Koine Irene. Similar successes were repeated again and again. Artaxerxes III was able to celebrate a great triumph only 10 years before Alexander's invasion, as in the year 343 he brought Egypt back into the empire. This remarkable stability of the empire may be attributed to a strong and developed imperial self-understanding. For the entire history of the empire, no foreign power or neighbor can be identified with which the Persian kings had to deal as an equal. The Persian Empire understood itself as a world empire. The limits of the empire were identical with the limits of the world. So let's turn to my second chapter, some considerations on structures. The Achaemenid Persian Empire did not have an official designation. Modern terms like Achaemenid Persian Empire, Tayspid Achaemenid Empire, Persian Empire, Achaemenid Empire, etc. are auxiliary constructions which always run into danger of being misleading. This is especially true for the term Persia, since Persia in the modern sense did not yet exist. The region of Parsa, Greek Persis, the core land of the Achaemenid dynasty, can be roughly equated with the modern province of Fars. It was only a small part of the empire, but never referred to the empire as a whole. Also the term Iran was of no help for it did not yet exist. Since there was no official designation for the state as such, already in antiquity, neighbors from outside the empire used makeshift terms. Thus the Greeks talked about Asia, the Persians, or the Medes. And people from the Arabian Peninsula appear to have designated the empire as Chaldea. From inside the empire was bound to the person of the great king, who ruled many lands that were supposed to represent the world. The kings used a set of different and changing royal titles that were not canonically fixed, but there was a certain amount of flexibility that was guided by perspective. In some regions, like Egypt, the great king still used the age-old local titles. The lists of lands that appear in the inscription of Darius I and Xerxes may demonstrate the desire to territorialize the world ruled by the great king. He and his lineage were the center of the empire that can be described as a kind of composite state. At the same time, it was an ancient Eastern universal monarchy. This shows itself both in the organization of the empire as in its ideological foundation. To be sure, in both areas, there are also significant differences from the previous empires, which are certainly relevant. Let us first glance at the ideological foundation, on which the imperial idea can most certainly clearly be read. The king understood himself as the divinely legitimated ruler of the world, who was given this office in order to protect the order of the world. Self-understanding, the conception and ideology of rule are most clearly presented in the generally multilingual royal inscriptions. A significant part of these inscriptions appear in the form of foundation inscriptions. The most famous example is probably the Cyrus cylinder you can see here, either archaeologically attested in situ or found on media which could have also been used as foundation deposits. For most of these texts, there existed copies to be read, studied, and disseminated. This is an important aspect. Other texts were published on stelae or rock inscriptions, of which also copies were made. All these texts were definitely not only created for the gods, but for contemporaries and posterity in order to present and legitimate the great king's rule. It has often been denied that ancient Eastern royal inscriptions addressed a broader public. A closer look at the available sources, however, reveals that they played an important role in the strategies of legitimization and, therefore, focused directly and or indirectly on the contemporary and future imperial and regional elites. There is ample evidence for this in Neo-Assyrian, Neo-Babylonian and Persian Achaemenid times. A central testimony of this strategy is a set of royal inscriptions from the Neo-Babylonian king Nabonidus, preserved in several exemplars on clay cylinders and tablets. They share a common text which compiled a series of inscriptions originally written on stelae of stone and dealing with the Ibaba, temple of the sun god Shamash in Sippar. It is not only the practice of organizing a compilation of several texts that deserves attention. Even more interesting is the colophon of the text, which you can see behind me. There we can read, I quote, "The work of Sin, Lord of the gods and the goddess who inhabit heaven and earth, encompassing what I, Nabonidus, have written down on a stele of stone, also to be heard by future generations to come." End of quote. The term for stele, asumitu in Akkadian, is exactly the same that we encounter in another remarkable document held in the British Museum. This is a letter that documents how eager Cambyses was to receive detailed information about the contents of the official inscriptions published by his predecessors. For this reason, he sent messages to the Yana temple in the city of Uruk, where obviously a considerable amount of such texts could be found. The messengers took with them instructions that these texts had to be shown to them. There is no doubt that they studied and probably copied their content. This not only testifies to historical consciousness, including research, but also the intention that the texts, originals and copies were read, heard, and studied. The rock inscriptions, as well as inscriptions on architectural elements, belong to this category of texts. A distinctive group of inscriptions on stelae, which were erected at very carefully chosen locations, and this is a prominent example, which originally stood in the city of Babylon. When one considers the spatial distributions of these inscriptions, then one can be certain, even after allowing for accidents or of survival, that inscriptions are concentrated in certain core zones of the empire. This is especially true to the great residences, such as Bazar Gadai, probably founded by Cyrus, Persepolis, Ekbatana, modern Hamadan, and its environment, the Elvand inscriptions, Susa, as well as, with some reservations, Babylon and Van, an old residence which was not, at least as far as we know, used by the Persian kings. Two other locations, both of them linked with special religious traditions, can be grouped with these: Bizitun, a sacred site at modern Kermanshah at the beginning of the Silk Road, and Nakshi Rustam, which together with nearby Persepolis served as the place of burial for the Achaemenid kings. Outside of this core zone, I show you a picture of the empire in its totality. Outside of this core zone, some further places have been chosen to erect significant inscription. Suez, where some stelae of Darius were excavated, which commemorate the construction of the canal connecting the Nile and the Red Sea, which he initiated. Moreover, border regions have been outstanding areas for the erection of such texts and the demonstration of royal power and reach. Some of these texts are only testified in classical sources, like the stelae that Darius installed at the northern and southern shores of the Bosporus. Others are spectacular new findings, like the recently discovered fragment of a royal inscription from Phanagoria on the Taman Peninsula. If one ignores the texts from border regions, the inscriptions are concentrated in three broad regions: Persis Elam, which corresponds to the ancestral lands of the Thespids and Achaemenids; Media, in a broad sense, including eastern Anatolia, which may be seen as one of the first great conquests of Cyrus; and Babylon, the residence of the rulers of the empire immediately preceding the Persians, also conquered by Cyrus. The three languages most prominent in inscriptions, namely Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian, testify to the conscious choice of these core regions to erect inscriptions. On only a few monuments, such as the already mentioned Suez stele, Egyptian was used as the fourth language. This does not mean that individual inscriptions were never translated into other languages. On the contrary, this can be demonstrated in the case of the Bizitun inscription and the grave inscription of Darius, Aramaic translations of which were found on papyri at Elephantine. Such translations could have circulated in different languages across the whole empire. This does not, however, change the fact that inscriptions conceived as monuments and intended to be visible to posterity remained concentrated in the core zone of the empire. The clustering of texts in the residences and palaces of this core zone can be connected with an observation that Irene Winter made for the reliefs decorating the walls of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. It is these palaces and their textual and pictorial programs that present the proper center of the world. So I just quote Irene Winter: "The whole throne room, in this case Ashurnasirpal II in the southwest palace of Kalchu Nimrud, can then be read as a statement of the establishment and maintenance of the exterior state through military conquest and tribute, and the maintenance of the internal state through cultic observances achieved through the person of the all-powerful king." End of the quote. What Irene Winter concluded for the core areas of the Neo-Assyrian Empire holds also true for the Persian Achaemenid Empire. So this is the second quote here you can read. I quote again. This, that is the textual and pictorial program of the palaces, is not, however, the biography of an individual or his personal propaganda, but rather the ideology of the state. End of quote. So if we arrange the Persian Achaemenid inscription according to major topics, altogether, three different complexes of themes emerge: legitimation by deed, legitimation by divine sanction, and legitimation by descent. Regarding the self-presentation of the kings, the following points are significant: the extent of rule, the borders of rule, and the responsibilities and obligations of the monarch. These fundamental elements of royal ideology and self-representation are in no way distributed equally across all of the inscriptions, but on the contrary, significant changes over the course of time can be established. In the first 100 years, it is possible to speak of a formative phase of experimentation, which reaches its conclusion with Artaxerxes I. Let us briefly consider the most important points. So let's start with legitimation by deed. We encounter this strategy of legitimation in only two documents: the Cyrus cylinder, we have just seen it, of Cyrus the Great, and the Pisidun inscription, which you see here, or not the inscription, but the relief. The inscription is below and on the side. Found in Babylon, the Cyrus cylinder is characteristically a document in the Babylonian language belonging to the Assyrian and Babylonian tradition. In it, the Persian king, who appears as king of Anshan, presents himself as the chosen of the Babylonian god Marduk. With this help, the negatively characterized king of Babylon, Nabonidus, was defeated, whereupon his empire fell into the hands of Cyrus. In this narrative, the military-political deed completed under divine aegis plays a decisive role. This strategy, legitimation by deed, experienced a temporary intensification in the Pisidun inscription of Darius I. It relates in its main section not only how Darius became king, but also how, with 19 battles in a single year, he subjugated altogether 9 powerful opponents. These opponents, and you can see them all together, these opponents he classified as liar kings, who had, though, to challenge his rule over the whole or part of the empire. Fundamental significance is thereby assigned to the historical event. Military conflicts are dated down to the day and geographically located. Different actors are named and some casualty figures are provided. In an appendix to the inscription carried out shortly after the completion of the main text, the deed already loses much of its definition as a historically unique event. Deeds play no further role amongst any of the successors of Darius I and Xerxes. Let's move to legitimation by divine sanction. This legitimation strategy is also deeply rooted in ancient Eastern tradition. It is present in every inscription and may be described as a constant factor in the representation of rule. As mentioned, it already appears in the Cyrus cylinder, where the Persian king is presented as the favorite of the Babylonian god. The Babylonian god Marduk is presented as a god of the whole world, who does not call upon a new king from the Babylonian heartland, but reaches out to a prince from distant Anshan. So the crucial lines are these one here. I just quote: Marduk scanned and checked all the countries, looking for a righteous king dear to his heart. And finally he took with his very hand Cyrus, king of the city of Anshan, and calling his name, he appointed him to be king of the entire world. End of quote. Whether Cyrus himself appealed to Marduk may certainly be doubted. Instead, this is much more a realization of the multi-ethnic and multicultural aspect of the Persian Empire. This allowed an approach of representation which was in some ways quite flexible. What is sometimes classified as structural tolerance or equidistance is actually a conscious engagement in broadening the space of acceptance. Since content and message of the inscriptions were disseminated all over the empire, the addressees were not only the higher echelons of court elites, but also the local elites whose acceptance was seminal for the success of any empire. For the first time in the history of the ancient East, starting with Darius, the Achaemenid Persian kings published their inscriptions nearly regularly in multilingual versions: Babylonian, Elamite, Old Persian, and in Egypt also Egyptian, thus highlighting the multi-ethnic character of their rule. This also implied the observance of local traditions, which had grown up in different places. The Persian kings introduced themselves into them and modeled their rule in different regions on the individual local contexts. This became especially significant in Egypt, where the Persian kings could behave as pharaohs. But the same was the case in Babylonia. With Darius, the first inscriptions in the Persian Median core lands, a new divinity is introduced in the form of Ahura Mazda. This god came to have a dominant function in the legitimation of rule. It is he who grants the king rule and stands by him, as is said again and again in slightly different words. And just to introduce an example of inscription from Persepolis, I quote, "The great Ahura Mazda, the greatest of the gods, he created Darius king. He bestowed the kingship upon him by the favor of Ahura Mazda. Darius is king." Let's move to legitimation through descent. The strategy of legitimation is also to be seen as an ancient Eastern one. Cyrus made use of it just like Darius and the kings after him did. While Cyrus placed himself at the head of the traditional line of three ancestors, the founder of the lineage, Thespis, grandfather and father, this principle was already changed by Darius I, who introduced 8 royal ancestors descending from Achaemenes, the founder of his lineage. More than a century later, Artaxerxes III still offered a family tree which introduced not only all the kings before him, but also the ancestors of Darius. In this way, the Thespids were completely erased. The emphasis on the maintenance of rule within a single family, within which it always passed from father to son, remained fundamental. At the same time, we encounter a self-understanding of rule, where the king was given a series of tasks which he had to accomplish. Let's have a look at these tasks and obligations. The great king, who was seen as a human being, was appointed to his office by Ahura Mazda. The latter is not only responsible for the creation of all good things, but also for the institution of kingship, which was presented as an integral part of this creation. Thus, in an inscription from Susa, Darius puts it in the following way. I quote again, as you can see, you can read together with me. I quote, "A great God is Ahura Mazda, who created this earth, who created yonder sky, who created man, who created happiness for man, who made Darius king, one king of many, one lord of many." End of quote. With the institution of kingship comes a series of obligations, not only of the subjects, but also of the king. Thus the king secures peace and well-being in a well-ordered world for his subjects. This task is defined against a world in uproar, a condition which Darius took upon himself to overcome. The royal concerns are most impressively stated in the inscriptions Darius Nakshi Rustam B. These efforts towards a sensibly ordered, peaceful world have been described as Pax Achemenidica by modern scholarship, The aforementioned inscription runs as follows. That's just a central passage again from Darius Nakshi Rustam B. I quote again. Proclaims Darius the king, by the favor of our master, I am of such a kind that I am friendly to right, but I am not friendly to wrong. It is not my desire that the weak one might be treated wrongly for the strong one's sake, and that is not my desire that the strong one might be treated wrongly for the weak one's sake. End of quote. A judiciously active king who was gifted with extraordinary physical and mental abilities, who could present himself as both a wise judge and a battle-tested warrior, and who knew himself to be supported by loyal subjects, was a necessary part of this rule of order. If this loyalty towards the king should come into question, then the principle hostile to order, the lie, drauga, would win the upper hand. The great kings are guarantees to hold this principle hostile to the order of the world in check. Of course, the empire functioned not only on the basis of ideological foundations, although it is there that the idea of imperial rule is most clearly presented. The Persian kings leaned much more on a developed bureaucratic apparatus, whose roots stretch back to the empires which came before them. Here local traditions played a significant role. This is expressed in the choice of scripts and writing media. Ancient writing systems were still in use in Egypt and Babylonia. Elamite also rejoiced in a great significance as a language of administration in Susiani, Fars, and as far as Central Asia and the Caucasus region, as 2 fragments of a cuneiform tablet from Kandahar demonstrate and 3 tablets from Armavir Agishta-Chinili. A newly invented writing system, which was used both for royal inscriptions and for administration, elevated Old Persian to the status of a written language under the patronage of Darius I. Across the empire as a whole, Aramaic seems to have been especially popular, as texts in this language have been found from Anatolia to the Far East, although we remain relatively poorly informed about the details. The frequently multilingual nature of the administration is especially significant in Persepolis, where in addition to the dominant Elamite and the less dominant Aramaic, texts have survived in Phrygian, Babylonian, Greek, and Old Persian. While the main focus of this archive is indeed on the neighborhood of Persepolis, government processes which affect the whole empire are nevertheless visible. It is organized into many provinces overseen by governors and their bureaucrats. These had responsibility for judicial and fiscal tasks. Provinces and center communicated over a well-developed system of roads. Although the distribution of evidence about different provinces is very uneven, the first impression is of a certain independence of the different local administrations. However, the center was also very interested in protecting its interests in the provinces and kept a watchful eye on local going-ons. A capital city in the proper sense is not identifiable. The king and his court were to a certain extent mobile, although at regular intervals they stopped in the great residence cities. This mobile court model of imperial integration was used as an omnipresent contact zone and later successfully adopted by the Seleucids. The state was neither centralized nor was it despotic or absolutistic. The great king was also bound to custom and tradition and could not simply act as according to his whim. He was seen not as God, but rather as man who took responsibility for his subjects and communicated with the gods from a privileged position. With Darius, the empire and the imperial elite began to be defined as Persian. A Persian elite which held the chief offices in the imperial bureaucracy is described very subtly as an ethnoclass dominant by Pierre Briand. However, rather than describing an ethnically exclusive club, the designation Persian appears to refer to a social category classifying a dynamic and permeable group of fellows. Persians dominated the more important offices at court and in the provinces. This imperial nobility was hierarchically structured and organized in an elaborate system of networks of relationship. Royal gifts and communal ritual meals played a significant role in this context. Loyalty was rewarded with benefications. Disloyalty was strictly punished. Punishment included ostentatious staging of staging of execution and mutilation, as well as deportation of larger communities. The striking importance of a trans-regional elite network centering around the king becomes apparent by the king's marriage policy. As it appears, a remarkable change took place with the Achaemenids, who, as a rule, did not marry any more foreign princesses. It was now nearly exclusively the Persian nobility from which they recruited their wives. This specific behavior has been described as a dramatic rejection of earlier ancient Near Eastern tradition of interdynastic marriages. The focus on an ethnically defined in-group is strongly emphasized in one of the two inscriptions of Darius at Naqshi Rustam, so Naqshi Rustam again, this time Naqshi Rustam A. I quote, "I am Darius, the great king, king of kings, king of the countries containing all races, king of this great earth even far off, the son of Hystaspes, an Achaemenid, a Persian, the son of a Persian, an Aryan of Aryan lineage." End of quote. Although we do not exactly know what is meant by Aryan of Aryan lineage, an ethno-linguistic characterization of the king and the imperial elite can hardly be denied. Moreover, the old Persian text, which was put into writing at Darius' command, is described as Arya in the Pisitun inscription. One seeks in vain for a comparable qualification of rule in the preceding ancient Near Eastern empires. This innovation is probably connected with the multi-ethnic character of the empire, which intensified with every new conquest. Special attention at the structural level deserves to be paid to the military organization of the empire. The army seems to have been multi-ethnically organized, with the troops divided into bodies corresponding to national groups. While earlier Near Eastern empires established their military potential as territorial land powers, the Persian Empire took an additional step whereby it established a navy and the corresponding capabilities. In this task, it relied first and foremost on the competence and know-how of the maritime cities on the coast of the Levant, on Cyprus, as well as southern and western Anatolia. This aspect came to have an enormous importance in terms of innovation and history of empire. It has equal significance as the Athenian fleet-building program initiated by Themistocles, which faced this threat and was, in the end, able to successfully meet it. Extension of rule is not one to be simply treated on the level of geographical and political facts, attesting to the actual size of the Persian Achaemenid Empire. An important ideological element also belongs here, since mental mapping and the perception of rule is at least of equal significance. I will deal with this in more detail in the third lecture. This shows itself already in the circumstances that in the Achaemenid royal inscriptions, the extent of the empire is not invoked by adding up administrative units, that is, provinces, but more probably through lists of lands which make up the different regions of the empire, probably charged by historical connotations. Moreover, the reach of the empire was not marked by fixed border lines. Rather, imperial reach transcended into border regions which developed their own perceptions of space, rule, and identity. Regions whose inhabitants probably saw themselves as in no way part of the empire, could be treated as ruled districts in the lists. In the Cyrus cylinder, we do not yet encounter these lists of lands, which can certainly be attributed to the Babylonian perspective of this text. They are for the most part confined to the time of Darius I and Xerxes. Nevertheless, Cyrus already appears as a world ruler. He calls himself, I quote, King of the world, the great king, the mighty king, the king of Babylon, king of the land of Sumer and Akkad, the king of the four quarters of the world. End of quote. In the lists of lands of Darius, this world rule becomes more concrete. However, the sequence of lands was in no way fixed, but instead varied in the course of time. As a rule, these lists are introduced with a fixed formula, I quote, by the favor of our master, these are the countries of which I took possession together with this Persian people, which feared me and brought tribute, Baji, to me. End of quote. The connection with tribute and taxes expresses the character of the lists as representations of rule. It is striking that the inhabitants of Parsa, Persis Fars, appear to be excluded from them. The lists of lands usually begin with Elam, Media and Babylonia, and thus remind the audience of the major importance of these regions in which inscriptions were mainly erected. In any case, the lists together with the pictorial monuments in the provinces highlight and disseminate the great king's claim for trans-territorial rule. With Darius I, a new type of royal grave, of royal tomb architecture, came into being, which continued in use at Naxirustam and Persepolis until the end of the empire. On the facade of these tombs stands the king praying before an altar over which the so-called man in the winged sun disk, probably Ahura Mazda, floats atop a platform which is supported by all of the peoples of the empire. So you can see here the two examples from the tombs of Darius and Xerxes. The first picture is mine, the second one is from the catalogue of the exhibition. Each people is represented by a single figure, differentiated by their dress and ornament. On tomb 1, this is Darius' tomb, and 5, this is probably Artaxerxes III. These figures are also identified by trilingual inscriptions. This pictorial presentation is joined by a larger inscription which is only present on the tomb of Darius I. There, the king names first of all 29 lands, Dahiava, which he rules, I quote, aside from Parsa. In the following list, exactly the same lands appear as are represented as throne bearers on the relief, with a single difference that the representative of Parsa also appears there, and very prominently in the first place, in fact. Immediately afterwards, so the inscription at Naxirustam holds the following. So here you can see again an example of the man in the sun disk from Pisitun, and now the text I'm going to quote from Naxirustam A again. Proclaims Darius the king, Our master, when he saw this earth in turmoil, after that he bestowed it upon me he made king. I am king. By the favor of our master, I put it in its proper place. What I have said to them, that they did, as was my desire. But if you think, how many are those countries which Darius the king held? Look at the sculptured figures. Look at the sculptured figures. Look at them. Which bear the throne platform. Then you shall perceive. Then it shall become known to you. The spear of the Persian man has gone forth far away. Then it shall become known to you. The Persian man has repulsed the enemy far away from Parsa. End of quote. Given this context, the facade of the tomb shows itself as a pictorial presentation of the Persian Empire, at the head of which the Persian king figures as ruler of the world by the grace of our master. The parade of lands and people, which is thereby introduced, demonstrates not only the geographical progress of this rule, but also its organization, in which the many lands, personified as single individuals, support the rule of the great kings in their hands. Lists of lands and reliefs of throne bearers therefore represent an imperial charter which underlines the claim of the Achaemenid kings to rule the world. Similar depictions of reliefs of throne bearers are encountered in the palace area of Persepolis. On the two great facades, north and west of the Apadana, or throne hall, an additional program of depictions with imperial connotations is found. In the center of the staircase, which provides access to the platform, waits the enthroned king amidst all the splendors of his court, and before him a high official makes a reverent gesture, which seems to announce the events which are to follow, that is, a series of audiences for delegations of every land of empire which represent the empire and thereby the world. Altogether 23 delegations are portrayed, which, depicted on the wings of the staircase and accompanied by a Persian court official, wait to pay their respects to the king. They are dressed in their individual national costumes and carry gifts destined for the great king, which can be called typical local products. Although the depictions bear no inscriptions and the identity of specific delegations remains subject to controversy in the literature, on the whole, a coherent picture appears, which connects the great king dwelling in the center of his domain with the lands which he rules and with their peoples. This connection among great king, residence, and domain is strongly expressed in another document. In the so-called Foundation Charter of Susa, Darius describes the building of his palace at the city. While raw materials characterizing particular regions are gathered and used to build the palace, specialists from all parts of the empire are also summoned, who contribute to the construction project with their individual abilities and skills. The palace of the king becomes, in this way, a depiction of the empire and thereby of the world. The borders of the empire were not treated as a theme per se in the inscriptions. What lies beyond the listed and counted regions ruled by the great king remains obscure and is not mentioned. This strategy creates the impression that the borders of the empire correspond to the limits of the world. The silence about the existence of a world beyond gives way to a very unique form of universalism that stands out even within the history of the ancient Near East. This universalism not only covered territory but also knowledge, which had to be commanded demonstrably as well. Collecting and mastering the knowledge of the world was a major endeavor of ancient Eastern empires. Long before Alexandria, this effort had as a consequence the establishment of royal libraries organized by the kings and their scholars. The first attempts can be traced back through Middle Assyrian times, but these endeavors fully developed in Neo-Assyrian Empire with the establishment of Ashurbanibal's library in Nineveh. Although there is no direct evidence for similar libraries in Persian Achaemenid times, we can be sure that they existed. The same holds true for another aspect of ancient Eastern universalism. Beyond the expertise in Herrschaftswissen, in political and geographical dimensions, commanding and mastering the world also included the royal control of plants and animals in a universal way. This was the birth of botanical gardens and imperial menageries. All these installations were somehow related to the royal court, where the king exemplified his control of the world. The Persian Paradisos was an integral part of this ideological framework. A specific form of universalism was already introduced in the great Pisitun inscription, where the extraordinary threat which Darius has to face and his rule is exclusively a threat from within and not from without. Foreign opponents play no role in this worldview. This universalistic tendency develops stronger forms over the course of time, and step by step political and military affairs vanish from the inscriptions. This process was completed by the end of the reign of Xerxes. Historical events and thereby history completely vanished from the inscriptions of his successors. Aside from Ahura Mazda and the king with his list of royal ancestors in the genealogy, no other individuals are mentioned in the texts anymore. The empire becomes a static institution oriented towards eternity and sanctioned by the gods. History and events play no further role anymore, and in fact, their non-verbalization almost takes on a function in the legitimation of rule. In parallel to this, the spatial extent of the empire acquires new conceptual dimensions. If Cyrus had still made use of the model common in the ancient East, according to which the empire was bounded by the ocean at the edge of the world, Cambyses and Darius exploded this conception by insisting that they themselves had crossed this boundary. Although there are some precursors of this claim within the preceding history of the ancient East, one may rightly characterize the Persian Achaemenid Empire as the first empire in world history, staging a claim to rule plus ultra. Thereupon, not just the end of history, but the end of all imaginable expansion had been reached. What we face with the Persian Achaemenid Empire is a rare example of hyperpower in world history, as Rolf Strothmann put it, and I just quote him. You can see the quote behind me. The Achaemenid period had reached relatively peaceful because political hegemony in this period was claimed by a single hyperpower, the Persian Empire of the Achaemenid dynasty, whose political and military supremacy was never seriously challenged until the invasion of Alexander the Great. And he continues, referring to Arthur Eckstein's analysis of the Hellenistic world of war as a multipolar interstate anarchy. I quote again, the Hellenistic world, by contrast, was characterized by continuous, tremendously violent conflicts between several competing superpowers. So before I come to a definite end, I have to express my deep acknowledgements, of course, to the University of Innsbruck, the University of Wrocław, with my ongoing project, the Getty. I have the honor to be housed again in the Getty housing and having a working place at the Getty Villa. Especially my thanks go to Alexa Sekira, of course, and UCLA, and especially the Pourdavoud Center. And again, Raim, thank you so much for making this possible. Thank you for your attention.